My name is Marissa Aguilera Saints. I'm here at my mom's home in Boulder, Colorado, and we're going to record this interview now.
Okay, and my name is Maria Cristina Aguilera, and I'm here to share my immigration story from Cuba to the U.S. I am 68, and I came when I was 10 years old, so I've been in the United States 58 years.
Okay, so 58 years later, and this is still a really difficult conversation to have.
Oh
difficult
my goodness,
topic.
yes. I've been crying, but now I think I'm more composed to do this interview. It's a very emotional thing to think about my experience back then because I was such a little girl.
Yeah, there's lots of layers to all this and levels of, I think, trauma and identity and just a lot of story that goes with this. So thanks for being willing to dive into it.
Okay, so like I said, I was born in Havana, Cuba on September 28th, 1950. And I had a very lovely, wonderful life because my family was well-to-do. But everything changed in 1959 when Castro took over the government, and we had to flee. And we had to flee as refugees, which was a very difficult emotional thing for my parents because Cubans are very prideful people, and my father had to sign in order to get exit permits. They didn't call them visas, they called them exit permits to leave Cuba. My dad had to sign over all his personal belongings and all his personal assets, I should say, as personal as well as corporate assets, which meant that he had to give up our house and his company. He had a rebar factory that was very successful. He had to sign that all over to the government so that we could get our exit permit. We were only allowed one small suitcase per person, and of course no valuables, so a lot of families like mine dug up in their yards and hid their jewels and their gold, like my grandfather, buried some gold nuggets or gold bars in his backyard. And so once we got our exit permit, that was October 21st, 1960, when we left Cuba on an Eastern Airlines flight, which happened to be one of the last ones leaving from Cuba.
So, and Castro had overthrown the government. You were saying December 31st, end of the year.
Yeah, end of 59,
right.
right.
Like a year prior.
And here's an interesting story of mine because that evening, New Year's Eve, 1959, my grandmother, who I called Abby, took myself and my older brother to Cienfuegos, which is where my mom's family's from. And we were at my great-grandmother's house, who I called Ayita. And that was in Cienfuegos, Las Villas, which happened to be exactly where Batista, the terrible dictator that had ruled Cuba for a while, for a decade actually, he was hiding in Cienfuegos, and that's where he left Cuba from. And so that night, I'll never forget, I was scared. Oh my gosh, my grandmother had put us under like a tipped over bed because there were bombs falling and shells falling on the little courtyard in my great-grandma's house. And I was so scared, I wet my pants. And so that memory really stands out for me, as well as at the airport in Cuba when we were leaving. I was the oldest girl of 4, but my older brother Lou, who was just 13 months older than me, was like the little prince. So we were all sitting on this little wooden bench, and all of a sudden, all these militiamen in their green fatigues carrying machine guns were walking around, and they took my mom to another little room to search her, I guess, and left us sitting there. And I'll never forget how scared I was. I did not wet my pants that time, but I was extremely frightened because my mother had hidden some of her special jewels in a bun she had on the top of my head because I had very long hair at the time. So I really thought that I wasn't going to make it out. And so I feel like I still have a lot of trauma from those experiences.
Mm-hmm. I've heard these stories growing up, and I'm one step removed, and I can feel it, you know? Where is Papi? Where's my grandpa?
Oh, he did not come over with us. He had to stay behind because he had some more stuff to do with the company because Castro was nationalizing all the businesses. Lots of families buried their jewels and their valuables because everybody thought they were coming back shortly, like maybe 3 or 4 months. That's why we as kids were told that we were going on vacation, and I was like, yay, out of school on October 31st to go to the United States on vacation.
And yeah, what happens when you get here?
Well, what happens is more frightening experiences because my mother had always had servants, so she didn't know how to even fry an egg. And she was a terrible driver. I remember her horrible driving even in Cuba. So we got stopped a lot by policemen because she would run red lights and stop signs, and we were sure, sitting in the back seat of her little beat-up Chevy, that they were going to take her to jail, and we didn't have a dad, and so, it was very frightening.
Do you know how long it took for the family to reunite? Like
it took
for
about,
your dad to make it here?
I think my dad, it took 4 months for my dad to come.
And then where did you guys end up settling, and how did that come into being?
Well, when we first arrived, my dad's father and some of his siblings were already here, and they had places in Coral Gables. So they got us a Motel 6 type room on US 1, close to Coral Gables. And we lived there for a while, and that's where my mom learned how to cook in the little efficiency. And then we moved, when my dad arrived, we moved to Key Biscayne, which at the time was not the resorty place that it is today. It was very simple, and we lived there in a rental house, and that's where I first went to school. I was in 5th grade, and the kids were so mean to me because they knew that I was not American, and so they picked on me a lot. Even when we moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where I went to high school and college, the kids didn't know. This is 1964 when we moved to Wisconsin. I was in 9th grade. The kids wondered if I rode over in a boat and if my family lived in a grass hut. So they were pretty ignorant about Cuba, and they shouldn't have been, because this is 1964. The Bay of Pigs had occurred. The missile crisis had occurred. Things were in the news. Cuba was not exactly not known. So it was very difficult fitting in, trying to be as American as I could be so that people would like me. Before my dad joined us, I remember going with my mom to the Cuban emergency center that they set up in Miami, which was great because we didn't have to. We were the Cubans at the time, because of the situation with Fidel. We were accepted into this country under special humanitarian provisions. We did not have to go through all the other rigmarole that immigrants have to go through to even be able to stay here, to apply for asylum. And we were able, my dad was able to get a green card in a year, and then we were able to get citizenship after, of course, we went to school and studied the Constitution because you had to take a test. But I was in high school by then, and in 5 years we got our citizenship, which does not happen now.
Yeah, that was real fast track, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, on that note, what other opportunities were you given as immigrants?
Well, I know the emergency center, we went there for food since my mom couldn't cook. That was helpful. And, they directed us towards educational, schools and so forth. And because we had family there, my dad's siblings and my cousins were there, we tended to just really stick with the family in Coral Gables. And then after 3 years in Miami, he realized that there were so many Cubans. I think it was like 1.4 million Cubans had immigrated. He figured that he'd have better opportunities business-wise up north. So through his contacts with American companies like John Deere and Caterpillar.
Because he had been doing business with American clients when he owned his rebar company.
And not only
Cuba.
that, my grandfather's business, which was several generations old, was an extended hardware implement store in Old Havana. It's still there. The Aguilera plaque is still on the building. I mean, it's a museum now, but so my grandfather used to import earth moving equipment from American companies like John Deere, Caterpillar, and to Cuba. And so my dad had contacts, and he got an international job with Alice Chalmers. That was another earth moving equipment company that they imported.
What were the laws of the country at the time when you and your family immigrated? And did it make it difficult for your family to come here? Easy or difficult? So I guess what was the legal process?
Well, it was harder to leave Cuba than it was to get into the United States.
So this was a communist revolution happening.
Yeah.
So Cuba was very interested in getting dissidents out, and the U.S. was very interested in rescuing people from communism, right? Because the fear,
exactly,
Cold War, and the fear around all
because it was the
that.
Cold War, exactly. Mm-hmm. But here in the U.S., like I said before, we were accepted. The Cubans were accepted into the country under special humanitarian provisions because of the Cold War thing and the communists, and so we didn't have to wait for a visa or anything like that, like people have to now. Mm-hmm. And they had the wet foot, dry foot policy since the 1960s, which Obama actually stopped. But that meant that any Cuban who was found in the water would be sent back to Cuba. But any Cuban that landed on land would be able to stay here.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so there's been this preferential treatment within U.S. immigration law for Cuban refugees, asylums. Yes, actually, that only just ended, like you mentioned, with Obama. So
I think
was like
2017.
2017, 2016. Yeah. I'm curious about language and identity. So, can you speak to that?
Sure. Fortunately, we had gone to American schools. Mm-hmm. So I spoke English without an accent perfectly. But that didn't exactly buy me too much with the kids and with the society because I was tagged as different, But the story that I remember that broke my heart was my little brother Carlos, who was 4 when we came. And so by the time we moved to Miami Shores, he was like 5.5. Mm-hmm. And he was riding his tricycle in the alley, and he came into the house crying, calling for me, because I, as the oldest girl, always kind of mothered the little kids. And Cristi, he says, they call me stupid boy. They were calling him stupid boy because he couldn't speak English. So I had to go out there and not beat up the kids, but make it known that they were not to tease my little brother for not being able to speak English. So, when you come from a different country and a different language and a different culture, it's really very difficult to try to, as they say, assimilate, which in our language was fit in, be accepted. What was the other thing? Language and
just identity, how that fits into who you.
Oh my!
How you identify as who you are.
Yeah, my identity has always been difficult for me because I am very Cuban since I was 10 when I left, so a great part of my early childhood was spent there. But yet again, I'm also very American because I've lived here so long. And so I've always felt that I was a sort of chameleon. You know, those little lizards that turn colors to be able to hide from their predators? That's how I felt growing up. You know, if it helped me fit in, then I was very American. But if I could be my Cuban self with family and so forth, then I was my Cuban self. So it's been kind of a dual identity all my life, and at times problematic. And I have a huge hole in my heart because I can't go back to where I was born and see my house and my grandfather's house. I tried in 2009 going to Cuba with a humanitarian group here from Boulder, and they told me at the airport in Cancun that I couldn't board the plane because I was a Cuban national, even though I had an American passport, and I didn't have the right visa. So that experience also haunts me a lot. People say, oh, but now you can go back. Things are so much better. My fear of, I think maybe it was a good thing that I didn't get to board the plane, because maybe I would have gotten in trouble being an Aguilera, and I don't know. So I would love to go back to Cuba, but I'm scared.
Well, as you know, I was curious asking the question about language, just because I think people are forced to assimilate, still are. I think my hope is that as a country we'll start to appreciate the strengths in our differences and the different cultures that people bring with them and the languages. But yeah, I think there's a lot of identity that's lost in assimilation. What I'd like to say in wrapping it up is thank you so much for being willing to share your story. I think this is a gift to us as a family. I know your grandkids, my children, this is an important part of who they are, and it's important that we know where we come from and, the challenges we face that make us stronger. I also think that this is what makes our country beautiful and richer, is this tapestry of people from different places. And so I'm grateful for you being willing to access those painful places and the difficult memories that are still there, and to share that with us. So,
well, thank you, Marissa, for being involved in this project. It makes me feel very proud of you.
Love you, Mom.
I love you too.